There's something that happens really easily in a summer garden. The plant looks healthy, but the bushier it gets, the more I feel like cutting it back. I used to think that if I removed the extra leaves and branches, the plant would focus its energy on better fruit. But here's the thing. Plants don't always do what you expect. Some plants bounce back after pruning, but others slow down, wilt a bit, or take days just to recover. That left me confused. If pruning is supposed to help, why does the same thing improve one plant but weaken another? The more I observed, the more I realized summer isn't really the time to ask, how much more can I cut? The better question is, what does this plant actually need me to remove? Because tomatoes, cucumbers, watermelons, and peppers don't respond to pruning in the same way. In this video, I'll go through each plant one by one, not to follow a single pruning rule, but to see what to cut, what to keep, and when to stop. Tomatoes, the suckers I always remove. If there's one plant in my summer garden that I prune the most, it's almost always tomatoes. But the first thing I look for isn't the big leaves or the new fruit clusters. What I pay attention to most are the suckers growing between the main stem and the side branches. When they first appear, suckers are just tiny shoots sitting in the crotch of the plant. They're easy to miss if you only glance at the garden every day. The problem is those small shoots grow extremely fast. Within just a few weeks, a sucker can turn into an entire branch with its own leaves, flowers, and even fruit clusters. That's why I don't wait around for them to become full branches before dealing with them. With indeterminate tomatoes, I usually start paying attention when suckers are about 2 to 4 inches long. At that size, they're still soft and can usually be pinched off by hand. It takes only a few seconds, instead of using pruners on a woody branch that leaves a larger wound on the plant. I don't try to remove all the suckers on a tomato plant. If the plant is healthy, well supported, and still has enough space to grow, I often keep a few strong side branches instead of forcing it into a single stem. What I'm trying to avoid isn't having more branches. What I'm trying to avoid is a canopy that gets so dense that light can't reach the inside anymore, and I can barely see what's happening between the stems. After checking the suckers, I usually move down to the lowest part of the plant. Any leaves touching the soil or sitting too close to the ground are almost always the first ones I look at. Many gardeners prefer keeping about 6 to 12 inches of space between the soil surface and the lowest leaf layer. It helps reduce soil splash after rain and allows the base of the plant to dry faster after watering. I've also noticed that spotting pests becomes much easier when the lower part of the plant isn't too crowded. A quick glance is enough to catch unusual leaves, early disease spots, or areas that need closer attention. What I like about tomatoes is that the changes after pruning are usually easy to see. They're easier to tie up, easier to harvest, and I don't have to fight through a dense wall of leaves every time I look for ripe fruit. But over time, I realized my biggest mistake was assuming all summer crops respond the same way as tomatoes, and cucumbers were the first place where I learned that lesson very quickly. Cucumbers, the first leaves I remove. When I move from tomatoes to cucumbers, I quickly realize I'm no longer looking for suckers. What I pay attention to on cucumbers is almost always the leaves, especially the older leaves sitting at the bottom of the plant. These leaves are often the first place that tells me something is going wrong. After a few hot, humid days or a long stretch of rain, this is also the area I check first when I walk through the garden. One of the most common things I see on cucumbers is powdery mildew. At first, it just looks like a few small white spots on the leaf surface. Easy to miss if you're not paying attention. But what really gets my attention is how fast it spreads. A leaf that looks completely fine this week can go downhill fast when the conditions are right for the disease to move in. When a leaf is heavily yellowed, drying out, or clearly affected by powdery mildew, I usually remove it instead of trying to keep it. I don't want the plant to keep supporting a leaf that is barely contributing anything to its growth anymore. If most of the leaf surface is covered in white spots, or more than half of it has clearly turned yellow, I usually take that as a sign it's time to remove it. I don't try to save every leaf just because it's still attached to the plant. With vining cucumbers, I also like to keep the lower part a bit more open by removing the lowest leaves that are touching, or almost touching, the soil. This is usually the first group of leaves I look at when I start pruning. That helps the leaves dry faster after rain or watering, and it also makes it much easier for me to spot pests and early disease issues before they spread. Unlike tomatoes, my goal with cucumbers isn't to control the number of branches. The goal is to make it easier to spot problems and reduce the number of leaves that are becoming a burden on the plant. After lightly pruning older or diseased leaves, I usually find it much easier to check the plant overall. I can see the main vine more clearly, spot young fruits more easily, and notice any new changes in the days that follow. But with watermelons, I have to shift my thinking once again. Because what matters most isn't the leaves anymore. It's the number of fruits the plant is trying to support. Watermelons. I keep the main vine and remove side shoots. When I move to watermelons, I no longer look at the plant the same way I do with tomatoes or cucumbers. What I focus on first is the main vine. Which vine is the strongest? Which one is growing in a clear direction? And which one has the best potential to support fruit? With watermelons, I usually keep one strong main vine so the plant can concentrate its energy. The side shoots that spread outward, especially the weak ones, or the ones that don't carry good fruit potential, are the first I consider removing. I also pay attention to the small shoots growing along the main vine. When they're still young, pinching them off is much easier than letting them grow into full-side vines and then having to deal with them more aggressively later. Once the plant starts setting fruit, I don't cut right behind the fruit. I usually keep about 12 to 15 true leaves after each fruit, so the plant still has enough leaf surface to produce energy for the melon. This detail matters a lot. If you cut too close to the fruit, you risk removing the leaves that are feeding it. But if you leave too many side shoots, the plant starts spreading its energy in too many directions at once. With larger watermelon varieties, I tend to be careful about how many fruits I leave on each plant. In many cases, a healthy plant producing 1 to 2 strong melons is far more realistic than trying to support too many small ones at the same time. When choosing which fruit to keep, I look for melons sitting on strong vines, ones that are growing evenly and positioned well. Misshapen fruits, late-set melons, or those forming on weak-side vines are usually the ones I pay closer attention to before deciding whether to keep them. What I try to avoid is turning the plant into a tangled mess of vines, where I can no longer clearly see the main vine, fruit positions, or the overall direction of growth. With watermelons, pruning isn't about making the plant look cleaner, it's about giving it a clearer direction for fruit production. Watermelon is the plant that taught me not every leaf is extra. Some leaves absolutely need to stay, especially the ones positioned after the fruit, because they're working every day to feed it. And that's exactly what leads me to peppers, where the lesson almost flips completely. Some plants in midsummer actually do better when you leave them alone as much as possible. Peppers. The plant I leave alone the most. If I had to pick one plant I touch the least with my pruners in midsummer, it's usually peppers, especially once the plant is mature, flowering steadily, and already holding a lot of young fruit. I know some growers like topping pepper plants when they're still young to encourage branching, but by midsummer, when the plant has already shifted into fruiting mode, that's usually not something I want to do anymore. At this stage, the plant is using its leaf system to feed fruit and to create its own shade. If I remove too much foliage or make heavy cuts while it's already dealing with the summer heat, the plant may spend more time recovering instead of continuing to flower and hold fruit. Instead of looking for what to remove, I usually watch whether the plant is still producing new flowers, holding young fruit, and growing in a balanced way. If the answer is yes, I mostly let it do its thing. I also pay attention to leaf color, how upright the stems are, and how the fruit is developing. If the plant stays green, doesn't wilt for long periods, and the peppers continue sizing up normally, I don't see a need for heavy pruning. With peppers, I usually only step in when there's a clear reason, like a broken branch, parts of the plant touching the soil, or a diseased leaf that's clearly spreading and needs to be removed. This is probably the most counterintuitive lesson I've learned about summer pruning. Some plants don't need more from you. They need you to step back at the right time and not interrupt what's already working. 3 things I always cut first. After going through tomatoes, cucumbers, watermelons, and peppers, I realized each plant needs to be looked at differently. But there are 3 things I almost always deal with first, no matter what I'm pruning. The first is anything that's dead. A dry branch, a stem that's no longer green, or a leaf that's completely dried out usually isn't helping the plant do anything useful anymore. The second is anything that's damaged. If a branch has snapped from wind, got crushed while I was moving through the garden, or is clearly split, I usually cut it clean instead of leaving a torn wound behind. The third is anything showing signs of spreading disease. I don't panic when I see a small spot, but if a leaf or branch is clearly looking worse, I usually deal with it early rather than waiting for it to spread. A lot of people call this the 3D rule: dead, damaged, diseased. I think of it more simply as dead parts, broken parts, and sick parts usually come before any shaping or fine-tuning decisions. The important thing is I don't use the 3D rule as an excuse to over-prune. I only use it as the first filter before I think about anything else on the plant. And once those 3 categories are handled, I usually pause for a moment and look at the plant again. Because a lot of summer pruning mistakes start right after the part that needed removing is already gone. The biggest mistake I made when I first started pruning in summer was cutting too much at once. The plant would look instantly cleaner, but a few days later, I'd realize it wasn't as strong as I thought. So I started using a simple limit. I never remove more than about 25% of the healthy canopy in a single session. It's not a perfect number for every plant, but it keeps me from going overboard. Summer is different from winter because the plant is dealing with heat, flowering, and fruiting all at the same time. If you remove too many healthy leaves at once, you're basically taking away part of its energy factory. I also avoid heavy pruning during heat waves. If the forecast is showing several days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, I usually wait for cooler weather instead of adding more stress to the plant. Another thing I don't do is heavy pruning when the soil is dry. If the plant is already wilting from lack of water, I'd rather fix water and shade first before thinking about cutting anything. When I do need to prune, I prefer early morning or late afternoon. That way, the plant isn't immediately hit by strong sun right after getting fresh cuts. The 25% rule didn't instantly make me a better pruner, but it slowed me down, made me look closer, and reminded me that summer is not the time to take as much as possible. Before I cut anything, I usually give myself about 5 seconds just to look at the plant again. That short pause helps me avoid cutting just because I already have the pruners in my hand. With tomatoes, I ask, is this a small sucker that should be removed, or a strong branch the plant could actually use to carry more fruit? That one question alone keeps me from removing things out of habit. With cucumbers, I ask, is this leaf actually diseased, yellowing and dying, or is it still green and helping the plant feed its fruit? I don't want to turn disease prevention into the removal of too many healthy leaves. With watermelons, I ask, is this part making the vine more tangled, or is it sitting behind the fruit and helping feed the melon? Just that question alone makes me put the pruners down more often than not. With peppers, the question is simpler. Does this plant really need me to step in at all? If it's still flowering, holding fruit, and standing strong, sometimes the answer is simply no. Those 5 seconds don't slow the work down much, but they do shift me from cut because it looks crowded to cut because there's a clear reason. I started out believing that the more you prune summer plants, the healthier they get. But the longer I garden, the more I realize that's not true for every plant. Summer isn't the season to force plants to change the way I want them to. It's the season when they're already dealing with heat, flowering, setting fruit, and trying to finish a very demanding job. I don't really ask anymore how much I should cut from a plant. I ask what this plant actually needs me to leave in place so it can keep doing its job well. And maybe that's the biggest lesson I've learned from summer pruning. Sometimes the difference isn't what we cut away, but what we're patient enough to leave behind.